when does the action of Shakespeare's comedies happen? And when should it appear to be happening in performance? My interest in realism today is largely focused on these questions of time, always a pertinent matter around a playwright recognised even by contemporaries to be not of an age but for all time, and one so confident in his ability to deal with time dramatically that in The Winter's Tale he was even prepared to write dialogue for time himself. In what follows, I'm going to focus on two particular plays, Love's Labour's Lost and Much Ado About Nothing, partly because in 50 years now of watching Shakespeare's comedies, these are the only two I have never seen staged in modern dress, and I'm quite curious as to why that should be the case. I'm going to start by stating the obvious, as a convenient platform from which to move on over the rest of this talk to stating the even more obvious. First generalisation then, Shakespeare's comedies are utterly unlike the scripts which succeeded them after the Proscenium arch stage made realist sitcom the norm in Anglophone comedy from the 1660s onwards. In the present day theatrical repertory, Shakespearean comedy belongs in a category of its own, and it may in performance require special handling of a kind unsuitable for comedies written more recently. It would be very surprising, for instance, if this picture of what remains Sally Jacobs' most famous stage design was surmounted by the words RSC in The Importance of Being Earnest. For all the paradox, whimsy and irony of its script, Wilde's masterpiece, perhaps the most revived non-Shakespearean comedy in English, assumes a stage which will offer a mechanical simulation of secular reality. Hence this programme, for its first performance, specifies that the play's action is to be realised on life-sized 3D representations of, for instance, the garden at the Manor House, Woolton, and the morning room at the Manor House, Woolton. Just as significantly, and in just as un-Shakespearean a fashion, the programme also specifies exactly when the play's action is to appear to be taking place. Time, the present. That is, 1895. And the calendar at Woolton Hall hasn't either moved on or been erased through all this play's many, many revivals ever since. But even if you can't obviously stage Wildean comedy on a stage made for Shakespeare, it appears you can stage Shakespearean comedy on a stage made for Wilde. This, for instance, looks suspiciously like the morning room at the Manor House, Woolton. And this looks like Gwendolen and Cicely receiving a visit from a couple of random friends in the garden at the Manor House, Woolton. After one of the final matinees of this show, I'd arranged to meet one of these performers at the stage door, just a little further up Suffolk Street from the venue for the London Shakespeare Lectures, it turns out. And there she is, Lisa Dillon, who took over the lead role in these productions from Michelle Terry. Lisa Dillon, or as I should say, to those of us who knew her work before she sold out and turned professional, Lisa Stawiarski. Like so many of the greats, Lisa learned her craft in the Brownsea Island Open Air Theatre. Here I was reminded that this show was even mounted on an authentically Wildean stage. The last of the three playhouses in which those large and expensive country house sets were assembled was the Theatre Royal in the Haymarket, where An Ideal Husband was premiered just before The Importance of Being Earnest opened at the nearby St James's. But whatever the date of the architecture and the designs at the Haymarket, the script in which Lisa was appearing wasn't by Wilde, but by Shakespeare, since here we were at Christopher Luskin's interlinked RSC productions of Love's Labour's Lost and Much Ado About Nothing. These opened in Stratford in 2014, transferred thereafter to Chichester, and were last seen in London in spring 2017. Now, there are connections between Wilde and Love's Labour's Lost. Most obviously, Wilde's borrowing of one of the play's motifs for The Importance of Being Earnest, when he has Jack arrive at Woolton Hall during the second act in full mourning, so that we know that he's come to announce a death even before he speaks. This echoes the Princess of France's realisation at the end of her play that the similarly clad Mercade has come to give her the news of her father's death before he actually says so. Except that in Wilde, of course, not only is the play nowhere near over, but we know both that the dear departed, Jack's brother Ernest, is wholly fictitious, and that Algernon has beaten Jack to Woolton and has already been passing himself off as Ernest for much of the second act so far. Luscombe's Love's Labour's Lost, though, unlike his subsequent Twelfth Night, was interested not in 1895, but in a date 2 decades later. Like several preceding directors of Love's Labour's Lost, notably Ian Judge and Trevor Nunn, Luscombe set his production very specifically in the summer of 1914. But like fewer directors of Much Ado, he set his, Much Ado that is, at Christmas in 1918, double casting his leads across the 2 plays, so that Benedick's post-war wooing of Beatrice seemed like the sequel to Barone's pre-war courtship of Rosaline. As the quotations on this poster and the production's long itinerary suggests, this was a very successful theatrical venture, and it gave a great deal of pleasure to its audiences, not to mention gainful employment to a deserving team of carpenters, props buyers, costume makers, lighting technicians, assistant stage managers, and, I should perhaps blush to confess, mercenary hack writers of programme notes. Luscombe's productions, setting the plays in specific, recognisable time periods which are neither Shakespeare's nor ours, belong to a category of Shakespearean revivals which only became mainstream in the mid to late 20th century. In Shakespeare's own time, as we know, most plays seem to have been given in a sort of enhanced dressing-up box version of contemporary clothing, and with the addition of a few recognisable historical markers here and there for specific kings, and the advent of smarter togas for Romans, and the survival of obsolete Elizabethan motley for fools, that remained the norm for costuming Shakespeare well into the 18th century. But after that, to an abbreviated argument made at more length elsewhere by, among others, Nicola Watson, Walter Scott and J.R. Planchet happened, and suddenly it was as if a law had been introduced recommending the death penalty for any actor-manager found guilty of anachronism. In the 19th century, Shakespeare's histories and tragedies were to be performed strictly as if the action were taking place in the time of their characters, often on large sets representing specific castles at specific times. And that castle is the gatehouse to London Bridge in the Charles Keane production of Henry V, an interpolated episode of Henry's triumphant return to London. Among the comedies, A Midsummer Night's Dream, because set in and near ancient Athens, demanded ancient Greek costumes and massive sets depicting Athens. This one again by the Greaves brothers and again for Charles Keane in 1856. Apart from the similarly classical and hence tunic-clad Comedy of Errors, however, the other comedies were now to be costumed as if taking place in Shakespeare's own lifetime, so generally in clothes a bit like this. Yeah, or indeed this. This again is Charles Keane with Ellen Tree, Mrs. Keane, in Much Ado. The Once Upon a Time of the plays had given place to Once Upon a Time that was definitely 1598. Objecting that modern audiences didn't know how to read the conventions of Elizabethan dress, which for them carried all sorts of unhelpful connotations about Merry England and Morris dancing, and that anyway Shakespeare hadn't written his plays as fancy dress museum pieces and probably wasn't as keen on Morris dancing as some people made out, directors such as Barry Jackson were already experimenting with a return to modern dress in the 1920s and 30s. A third way between Elizabethanism and modern dress, though, the practice of setting the plays at some recognisable point between the Renaissance and our own time, has only caught on since the Second World War, and I should say strictly in the Anglophone theatre. It's really only in Britain and America that people are so manic about historical specificity in Shakespeare. This third way was pioneered by two figures nowadays more often cited as champions of the empty space and the open stage. In 1946, Peter Brook, hired by Barry Jackson when he was still only 20, directed This Love's Labour's Lost in what was then the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. That's Paul Schofield as Don Armado, and among the other figures on the right, down at the front, is a young Donald Sinden as Dumain. The clothes remained vaguely Elizabethan, but they hinted at commedia dell'arte and the Harlequinade, so that combined with the rococo detailing of the set and the rich yellows of the lighting, they seemed to place the play's action in an 18th century fête galante from a Watteau painting. Tyrone Guthrie followed this lead to somewhere much nearer the present in 1953, when he directed All's Well That Ends Well in Stratford, Ontario, as if it were by Shaw or Chekhov. He then repeated this experiment in the other Stratford, here, 6 years later. And Stanley can tell us about this production later on, much better than I can. In their crinolines, veils and lorgnettes, Edith Evans, Zoe Caldwell, Angela Badley and the rest made the script of this sour Elizabethan fairy tale seem to be happening to a cast of Edwardians. These two productions were very consciously taken as models by subsequent directors. In 1981, for instance, Trevor Nunn made what was in some important respects a remake of Guthrie's All's Well, this time with Peggy Ashcroft as the Countess and Harriet Walter as Helena. All three of these productions were described as autumnal, and they in their mode arguably partake of a general wistfulness about the past, visible in English culture since the war. It was quite cutting edge, incidentally, in 1981, that this mode of doing Shakespeare in a sort of modern but specific and not actually modern dress production was beginning to be adopted even in the non-professional theatre. Again from 1981, this is an Edwardian style production of As You Like It in Poole. Designed to look like a picnic out of three men in a boat, using the co-opted guitarist from a local surf revival band as the minstrel. It's a lovely blazer. I should stress here that I myself have no objection on principle to this sort of one play on the elaborately realistic set of another approach to Shakespeare, even though I'm nowadays very proud to be associated with flute theatre, whose low-budget minimalism can conjure the whole of Twelfth Night from a single acoustic guitar, and who can give you all the Hamlet you need using only 6 actors, a sofa, a box of photographs, and the skull of an unfortunate dog. I very much cherish the memory of Trevor Nunn's All's Well That Ends Well, and indeed display a copy of its poster on the wall outside my office as an implicit warning to any students or colleagues who may be tempted to speak of it with disrespect. It's important to recognise, though, as I shall show, that the use of non-modern, non-Elizabethan realistic period settings does very different things when imposed on different Shakespearean comedies. As with generalising polemics in favour of original practices or of modern dress, there are always caveats and exceptions to be made. But there is a very familiar critique that is often made about any production in this period-specific mode, and I may as well outline it here before setting out to qualify it, particularly in connection with the stage histories of Love's Labour's Lost and Much Ado over the remainder of this talk. Essentially, objectors to prose art revivals of Shakespearean comedy in which the costumes and the designs all match, so that they tie the play's action to a precise social milieu in a specific place at a single historical moment, tend to complain that such revivals impose post-Renaissance limits on Shakespeare's imagination. They drag his scripts, it is said, into our own stunted and utilitarian industrialised world in a manner complicit with one of received academic cultural history's favourite narratives of general decline. That narrative was most influentially outlined in Eric Auerbach's masterpiece, Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, 1946. It's the narrative of the fall into realism. Auerbach's chronological account of Western literature looks primarily at the long transition from epic to the novel, and it sees mainly a combination of disenchantment and downward mobility. In the beginning, classical poets and religious visionaries gave us the gods, and then epic heroes. Then their medieval successors gave us kings and knights errant, and then Cervantes happened, so that the chivalric romance dwindled into the realist novel, and the feudal Sir Lancelot was supplanted by the bourgeois Sir Charles Grandison. Auerbach only takes the story as far into the modern and as far down the social scale as Emma Bovary and Mrs. Ramsay, but you can see where it's going. Next stop, Leopold Bloom, and before you know where you are, elite literary fiction will be treating us to the adventures of addicted Scottish dropouts in Welsh's Trainspotting. Auerbach has comparatively little to say about drama, starting appropriately with a medieval fall play, La Mystère d'Adam, and finishing with the fall of Schiller's middle-class heroine, Louisa Miller. But he does touch on Shakespeare, who appears primarily as an anti-heroic colleague of Cervantes. The Shakespeare plays Auerbach singles out for discussion are, accordingly and perhaps misleadingly, Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, free of supernatural characters, set at particular non-imaginary locations in Shakespeare's own homeland, and featuring the nearest the canon ever gets to specifying a year, when the king mentions, not quite accurately, that it is now 1400 years since the crucifixion. For Auerbach, in short, Shakespeare is less the last of the ancients than the first of the moderns, and this view hasn't suited those for whom the whole point of the Shakespeare canon is that it gives us imaginative access to an unfallen, still numinous, handcrafted world in which pictures of Troy still looked much like pictures of Camelot, and for which history hadn't yet dwindled to a series of date-stamped landmarks in what Benedict Anderson would call the universal, empty, secular railway time of modern nationalism. For those invested in Shakespeare as a non-realist, the 1590s are liable to be remembered not as the crucible of secular historical drama documentary, but as a time when theatre audiences were still prepared to believe in ghosts and witches and fairies, and when theatre architects hadn't been distracted by fancy lighting and perspective scenery into forgetting that the space under the actors' feet was hell and the space above their heads was heaven. The most important early proponent of this view was Wilde's contemporary William Powell of the English Stage Society, who thought that in order to stage Shakespeare's plays properly, we needed to abandon all the machinery of realism and get back to something approximating the conditions and practices of the Elizabethan playhouse. This photograph depicts Powell's production of Measure for Measure at the Royalty Theatre in 1893. As you can see, instead of commissioning a fussy, elaborate antiquarian set complete with matching costumes, all distractingly and irrelevantly obsessed with a particular time period, Powell commissioned an elaborate, fussy antiquarian set complete with matching costumes, all distractingly and irrelevantly obsessed with a particular time period. The central problem of living in an era that has a different sense of historicity than did Shakespeare's is not so much solved here as slightly and anxiously relocated. The Once Upon a Time of the play has not only become Once Upon a Time that was definitely 1603, but Once Upon a Time that was definitely 1603 as if we're still saying it in 1603. The anachronistic taboo against anachronism, which Powell merely extended from costumes to staging, has, if anything, been extended still further by some of Powell's more recent disciples in places like Southwark and Stanton, Virginia, for whom antiquarian pseudo-Elizabethan stage sets like this one have simply expanded to become entire antiquarian pseudo-Elizabethan theatres, which for some of the plays and with some directors and performers can work very well, I hasten to add, even given that it has so far proved technically impossible to supply genuine Elizabethan playgoers to fill the pastiche Elizabethan benches. But for some of the plays, Pohl's approach has, I think, been definitely counterproductive, as I shall show. First, though, how well does the view of Shakespearean comedy as irreconcilable with the illusionist picture stage actually fit either the canon of Shakespearean comedy or our dominant account of the illusionist stage? Among these plays, certainly, A Midsummer Night's Dream isn't exactly bourgeois realism in embryo, and hence in part Peter Brook's decision, as we saw earlier, to park a white box of circus tricks in front of the stage space, which might otherwise have simulated a real palace and a real forest. And The Tempest doesn't exactly look like a manifesto for social realism either. But in fact, despite Brooke, these are two of the plays which over time the Proscenium Arch has liked best, and we forget at our peril that even if in the late 19th century perspective sets and illusionist scenery came to be associated with middle-class realism, they were invented to bring us the gods. The specimens of picture stage theatre, which Shakespeare himself had the chance to hear of or see, dealt not in minute present-day social observation, but in divine spectacle. One of the most influential early perspective auditoriums built in England for spoken drama rather than for a court masque was this one. And this, of course, is British Library manuscript ad F5505F21, as any few will know, designed by Inigo Jones and others when James I and his court visited the hall of Christ Church, Oxford in 1605. The high table end of the hall is to our left. The things labelled B are stair towers. Yes, and if you want to continue the general narrative of cultural decline, the one great non-realist performance I saw in this space was given by Gary Glitter, which I should not admit. Yes, where it's labelled H was where Imogen Stubbs was. This thing, as you can see from the side, it had sight lines, like a real theatre, hence the little I drawn where the H is there, and a raked stage. Though if you're at the back, you've only got 18 inches of leg room. You really want an upgrade for this one. The figures who came down this temporary structure's pioneering raked acting area, in between large triangular scenery pieces, which could be turned in mid-performance to change locations, were mainly nymphs, shepherds, satyrs, and Olympians. In Latin plays, including Alba and Vertumnus, and in Samuel Daniels' Arcadia Reformed, later retitled The Queen's Arcadia. And in a supplement to the notices, I should remark that a performance of The Queen's Arcadia will be given in that very hall at Christ Church on September the 15th, featuring a pre-show lecture by our own Dr. Elizabeth Sandys. Tickets still available. If any of Shakespeare's comedies look disappointingly short on gods and fairies, it may be because they're too far from the picture stage mode, as Shakespeare understood it, rather than too near it. And so far from being the scenes which the Proscenium Arch couldn't cope with, it was Shakespeare's representations of the supernatural which the new indoor theatres of the later 17th century found most congenial, turning, in particular, A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest into spectacular semi-operas. On the left, that's the frontispiece, of course, to Nicholas Rowe's 1709 edition of The Tempest, showing the play, how the opening looked on the stage in Rowe's time, and on the right, the title page of the Henry Purcell rewritten Midsummer Night's Dream, Fairy Queen. The subsequent rise of ballet dancing only made it more possible to stage fairies rather than less, and this lovely piece of scenery and choreography, again from Charles Keane's 1856 Dream, could easily have been recycled in other non-Shakespearean shows, especially at Christmas. To this day, British proscenium arch theatres earn much of their annual income from showing their audiences fairies, ghosts, and spectacular transformations in pantomimes. Shows which, as I've argued elsewhere, descend in part from the early 18th century's annual revivals of that restoration version of The Tempest over the festive season. Oh yes, they do. Tinker Bell always was a version of Ariel, and whether Tinker Bell and Ariel or Puck are staged on a mock Tudor open platform in the same light as the audience, or in a darkened red plush Theatre Royal, if you don't believe in fairies, they will all die. The problems and opportunities posed for modern stage interpreters, even by the conveniently fairy-free Much Ado and Love's Labour's Lost, it seems to me, don't arise because they are non-realist sorts of play that nowadays get performed on anachronistically realist stages. I'm going to deal with the plays in folio order, with Much Ado first, because I think that approaches which often only compound the problems encountered by modern revivals of Much Ado About Nothing, even though it's much the more popular of the two plays, can provide ideal solutions for Love's Labour's Lost. I hope a quick survey of characteristic designs for Much Ado, especially around the question of when its action is supposed to be taking place, will make the first part of this point for me. David Garrick would be one of the last actors ever to play Benedick in modern dress. Benedick and his reluctant challenge to Claudio made plenty of sense in the mid-1700s, a time when a gentleman's everyday outfit might still include a sword as a matter of course. Over the ensuing century, though, things changed. By Macready's time, Renaissance comedies demanded Renaissance mise-en-scène, and like it or not, Macready's Benedict had to wear those sort of tights. My guess is that he didn't like it very much at all. 150 years later, though, these equally oldie-worldy costumes had meant something different, perhaps something less. The problem which these costumes are trying to solve is a different one entirely. As a tightly constructed, secular, realistic-looking play about a well-nigh arranged marriage which takes place in a culture for which premarital sex is a killing matter, Much Ado was still, in Garrick's time, painfully timely. You could imagine people dressed like members of Garrick's audience sharing the attitudes expressed by Claudio and Leonato, which meant that you didn't need to set the play either long ago or far away or both. But from the mid-20th century onwards, the play was liable to become not just costume drama, but safe, escapist costume drama, the story of problems which are no longer ours, which I think is true for all of these very pretty sort of Cavalieri productions of the 80s and early 90s. John Barton's brilliant production, and also for Ken's film, of course, which similarly puts it in a sort of oldie world, realistic, slightly 18th century looking dress. John Barton's brilliant production, remembered now above all for Judi Dench's combination of verve and pathos, and for Donald Sinden's at once suave, crusty, and at times manically paranoid Benedick, solved this problem in part by setting the play among young subalterns and their older colleagues in the British Raj. That's the last moment when people were wearing dress swords in a way that suggested they might use them in private. Here one could believe in the hero plot while not quite feeling exempt from it. In 1976, this empire setting seemed historically distant, but uncomfortably, perhaps not distant enough. Reverting since then to the Macready tactic of setting the play in some approximation of Shakespeare's own period, by contrast, has produced much cosier results. As for the RSC in 1996 with Alex Jennings above, and the National in 2007. And centre bottom there, that's a picture of Simon Russell Beale dancing, which I think you should savour. It's a rare sight. Had a terrific Don John, that production, but was in other ways relatively forgettable. The surprise Barton had achieved with his 19th century colonial setting, furthermore, had largely worn off by the time Cheek by Jowl recycled it in 1998, by which time the jewel in the crown had already made such costumes the stuff of middlebrow television. Greg Doran returned the play to its specified location of Sicily, but only to the picturesquely fascist Sicily of the 1930s, again producing an effect of the safely picturesque rather than the urgent, with a very distracting motorbike. It was one of the best motorbikes I've ever seen in Much Ado, but I don't know how much it really helped the questions of the play. In 2005, Josie O'Rourke yet again set the play among 19th century officers up in Sheffield, and the following year, Marianne Elliott, presumably in what was by now a positively desperate search for a setting which would really hit a local contemporary nerve for her Stratford audiences, placed hers in pre-revolutionary Cuba. And this was an extremely timely production, but only insofar as its perpetual displays of the tango made it closely resemble a new television series which had just started airing on BBC One called Strictly Come Dancing, which Tamsin Gregg could walk away with, but which would be quite funny if Simon Russell Beale entered. The nearest any recent British stage production has come to giving us a modern dress Much Ado was O'Rourke's second production in London in 2011. And that one was marked as not being a specimen of anxious present-day realism by being placed very specifically in a lost archaeological era of undiluted kitsch, when dinosaurs stalked the earth and from which nothing that survives could possibly be taken seriously, namely the early 1980s. To see why stage directors haven't given us Much Ado in Modern Dress, I think you only have to look at Joss Whedon's film of 2012, which I personally find borderline unintelligible. This is a film which has always just left me wondering, who and where are all these awful, indistinguishable people who make their staff wear uniforms and can somehow spend all day drinking wine in each other's houses? And why do they go on about marriage but never mention divorce? And what's this problem they have over Hero? It's true that when the RSC staged the play in the same year, they didn't go for very long ago either, but they did go for quite far away, placing the action in the best exotic marigold modern India of incompetent family servants and honour killings. But in the courtyard, in fact, practically where I'm standing, this remained a play about other people's problems, not those of its audience. For all the plot's violence, Luscombe's 1918 country house setting just brought things comfortably home to Downton Abbey, a milieu in which we can still expect there to be liveried servants, and can still believe that the virginity of an heiress might be something over which gentlemen might fight to the death. The recurrent problem with Much Ado is that most of what once made its contents dangerous and serious and worth laughing about now looks like just one more aspect of its harmless period charm. Staging it on a big prosarch set that simulates the social world of 1598 instead of that of 1918 or whenever just chooses one mode of period charm over another. And for my money, putting on Much Ado in an entire playhouse that simulates a few of the playing conditions of 1598 into the bargain helps even less. I say this with feeling, having seen not just one but two productions of Much Ado double cast with Love's Labour's Lost in 2017, the second at the replica Blackfriars Playhouse in Virginia. I've never seen a Much Ado during which I've been so conscious and so sorry that this is a Shakespeare play whose script actually includes the words, "Hey, nonny, nonny." This show was folksy, it was big, it was the cutest Renaissance fair with a Y in town. It was one long ye olde doublet and hose punchline. And whatever this production thought the play's problem was, I was very glad it wasn't mine. And incidentally, next time somebody tries to tell you that building small theatres produces subtle, nuanced, close-up, really detailed acting, you've only got to point at this production. It's not true. Equally, big theatres don't necessarily produce the opposite. I mean, I sat at the very, very back, somewhere in what's now the restaurant, to see Peggy Ashcroft and Harriet come on in All's Well That Ends Well, and it remains one of the most intimate things that has ever happened to me. Good. But somehow, as long as we've established that, but somehow The Love's Labour's Lost, same actors, same space, same absence of set, many of the same clothes, was lovely. The same eagerly faked Tudor mise-en-scène that made Much Ado look irrelevant somehow only made Love's Labour's Lost more entrancing and more telling. If anything resembling nostalgia only sabotages Much Ado About Nothing, Love's Labour's Lost, in my experience, is instead thoroughly hospitable to it. And in this very last section of this talk, I want to conclude by suggesting why it should be that time behaves quite differently, not just in but around performances of Love's Labour's Lost. I admit that I'm perhaps still biased in favour of this play by having seen an exceptional production of it at an impressionable age, but bear with me. John Barton first directed Love's Labour's Lost for the RSC in 1965, in a production which sought to look as Elizabethan as possible. He dressed the men like figures from exquisite Hilliard miniatures, but had some difficulty in persuading the women to adopt authentically Elizabethan hairstyles, which didn't suit the aesthetic of 1965 nearly so well. In the rehearsal photos, that's Charles Thomas, who played Barone, with Janet Sussman, who played Rosalind, and that's Janet with Glenda Jackson, who played the Princess of France, up in the top left. In 1978, John Barton got the chance to direct the play again. Ralph Colty's set should have misfired completely. A realistically simulated corner of an Elizabethan park in a prosarch theatre with real boughs and leaves. How vulgar, how naff. And shouldn't the costumes have been a write-off as well? Here are a sample. As you can see, it's the usual Tudor look, tastefully adapted to suggest monastic academic seclusion, autumn weather, and good colour coordination. The overall effect ought to have been somewhere on the edge of mere merry English cliché, but it wasn't. And in fact, if you want me to cry remembering how good this show was, nothing could be easier. I queued for a student standby for one of its matinees after it transferred to the Aldwych, and 30 years later, I finally got to thank John Barton for it in detail during his 80th birthday party. I remember him saying that much as he had enjoyed working with the 1965 cast, this 1978 production was, of all the RSC shows he ever directed, the one for which he got the highest proportion of the actors he actually wanted. Here we see Richard Griffiths as the King of Navarre, Michael Pennington as Barone, Ian Charleson as Longaville, three men who could move weightlessly across a stage as if propelled by the grace of the verse alone. And off stage were the likes of Michael Hordern as Don Armado, David Suchet as Nathaniel, and Alan Rickman as Boyette. Meanwhile, the women included Jane Lapotaire as Rosaline, Carmen du Sautoy as the Princess, Sheridan Fitzgerald as Maria, and of all people, Ruby Wax. I'm not dreaming this, honestly. Ruby Wax as an entirely convincing and indeed rather touching Jacquinetta. So how come an Elizabethan look Much Ado is usually at best efficient, while an Elizabethanizing Love's Labour's Lost can be positively sublime? I think we may have to go back to the origins of this play to work out why. If Much Ado is a play which has only accidentally turned into a historical document of other times, Love's Labour's Lost is a play which deliberately sought to transform the historic into the nostalgic from its outset, a play which indeed thematizes that process. While Much Ado used to be timely, but ceased to be by sheer historical accident, when written, Love's Labour's Lost flirted deliberately and riskily with topicality, but opted deliberately for the mythic, determined not just to dance to the music of time, but to show that it was not confined to anything currently in the charts. There is an immense critical literature on the historical events alluded to in this play, on why Shakespeare touches on them at all, and on what effect, if any, this has had on the play's popularity and influence. Much of it has been written by obsessives and conspiracy theorists, and I'm very happy that I now only have about 3 minutes in which to summarise the entire matter. In brief, once upon a time there really was a King of Navarre, and there really were some courtiers called Barone, Longaville and Dumaine. and the king really was interested in humanist learning. And this King of Navarre actually did marry a princess of France. This ought to have constituted a happier ending than the suspended proposal with which we're left by the play, but unfortunately, immediately after the real-life wedding, many of the guests who had sat on the groom's side, together with hundreds of their allies, were slaughtered in the streets of Paris. This, then, is the scene which various incidental details of Love's Labour's Lost ought to be asking us to imagine, the St Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, a key event in the pan-European wars of religion which overshadowed Shakespeare's entire life. The plot premise of Love's Labour's Lost ought at very least to have reminded those of its audience up to speed with the details of French politics of the real-life embassy to the King of Navarre made by his estranged wife and mother-in-law in 1578 to discuss precisely the future of Aquitaine. And the fact that the King of Navarre in the play breaks an oath would surely have reminded many more that the real-life King of Navarre, by now Henri IV of France, had in 1593 broken an oath, the rather more serious one involved when he renounced his Protestantism in order to secure his power on the grounds, famously, that Paris was worth a mass. The play with which to double-cast Love's Labour's Lost really ought not to be Much Ado About Nothing at all, but a play by Shakespeare's colleague Christopher Marlowe. It might be rather piquant to see the same Dumain writing love poetry one night and then the next night suggesting that he should take some archers to the bridges over the Seine and finish off those Protestants already driven into the river. But it would also miraculously be irrelevant, because this entire aspect of Love's Labour's Lost turns out to be a sort of poignant tease. Marlowe's play definitely happens in France in 1572. Love's Labour's Lost happens in a France that never was, in a year that never was. The courtly, leisured interlude this play asks us to imagine isn't just a happy peacetime before the massacre, nor does the play work solely because it imagines a France in which there seems to be only the scholarship and poetry of the Renaissance and none of the discord and bloodshed of the Reformation. Its historical allusions serve instead deliberately to remind us of realities outside the play, which we too are for the time being escaping into its sonnets and charades. We already know this idyll is inauthentic and fragile, even before the news of the offstage death of the princess's father reminds us that soon the play will be over and we will have to go back to being mortal and ourselves. The world depicted in Love's Labour's Lost may contain pedants and constables rather than satyrs, but it's recognisable as a province of Greek myth just the same. Its entire non-plot a replaying of that other full myth by which death intrudes into Arcadia, consciously superimposed on the real, merely historical world of cruelty and discord. As the modern performance history of Love's Labour's Lost demonstrates furthermore, in place of a Renaissance France found only in the play's parallel and better universe, other cliched shorthands for lost idylls will do very nicely. The connotations of over-easy resort to stereotype which bedevil Much Ado only assist this play, whether those evoked by the familiar, always already mock Tudor woodwork of the Globe in Dominic Dromgole's production of 2007, or by the oaks, the simulated oaks that is, favoured by Greg Doran in 2008, or indeed by that Eve of War Zuleika Dobson Oxford offered by Ian Judge in 1993 and then recapitulated in the very similar production put on by Trevor Nunn at the National in 2002. Or, to return to where we started, to that summer of 1914 Importance of Thinking You're Being Earnest Country House, favoured by Christopher Luscombe. Time is an urgent matter in Much Ado About Nothing, but with its passage, that play's very realism has become a curse, helping history to get the better of it. Love's Labour's Lost was all about trying to sidestep history from the start, and it turns out that there are still any number of ways, realist or not, in which the Shakespearean theatre can take us to Arcadia, some of them even using a proscenium arch. The sad, nostalgic truth is, though, that we still don't get to stay there, and I close on a note of sheer realism. He may be dressed like Jack Worthing or like Hamlet. He may belong to 1914 or 1572 or 1978, but at the end of Act 5, Mercade will still be coming for us.